When water started to rise in Genesadage in the first months of 2019, so did pressure on the government. Residents sandbags and built dams, trying to avoid submersion like they experienced last year, knowing the problem, exacerbated by climate change, is only getting worse. Months later, in September, the call to arms about climate change was heard by nearly 500,000 people.
Indigenous people lead this fight.
Led by Indigenous youth and activist Greta Thunberg, the city's streets were inundated by people urging action on a global scale. The residual effects of climate change were felt across the province over the course of the year. Members of the Algonquin Nation, for example, held a late August sit-in demanding a moratorium on moose hunting amidst dwindling herd numbers. But the year was also marked by demonstrations of solidarity across borders. When the Amazon rainforest went up in flames, Montreal rallied to hold a benefit supporting Indigenous female warriors in Brazil. The standoff at Unistoten prompted a number of anti-pipeline demonstrations across the city. This one blocking a main roadway outside Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's constituency office.
No trespass, no consent.
With the help of other activists, Marlene Hale, known as the only Wet'suwet'en in Quebec, gained access to a meeting in Saint-Hyacinthe in order to question the Prime Minister directly.
The Wet'suwet'en have demonstrated in the Supreme Court over and over again that the hereditary chiefs are the decision makers on our land.
And following his re-election to minority government in October, Trudeau says he intends to continue walking the path of reconciliation through policy changes.
We will govern for everyone.
But throughout 2019, communities undertook their own healing work, purifying the site of a former residential school, for example, or unveiling a monument dedicated to Indigenous women in Val d'Or.
Dénoncer l'injustice, dénoncer la violence, dénoncer les abus.
But among those who requested an audience with the Prime Minister this year was the Genesadage Mohawk Longhouse, who are still awaiting response to an open invitation to visit and hopefully resolve a land claim centuries old. The continued development on disputed land in neighboring Oka prompted a number of demonstrations and public meetings in 2019. Eventually culminating in a residents' 10-day-long hunger strike to draw attention to the cause. But the year was undoubtedly punctuated by conversations about child welfare. A scathing report out of Montreal found that scores of Indigenous children were apprehended from a downtown daycare and placed in non-native foster homes. The problem, however, touches all of Quebec and prompted this Algonquin man, Xavier Mouchoum, to file a $3 billion class action lawsuit. Mouchoum spent 10 years in foster care and testified about his experiences at the Viens Commission hearings. One of hundreds of First Nations, Inuit and Métis people who described inequities and mistreatment in government services.
Dans une société développée comme la nôtre, ce constat est tout simplement inacceptable.
The Commission's final report, released in September 2019, prompted a public apology from Premier François Legault at the National Assembly.
L'État québécois a manqué à son devoir envers vous. Il vous demande aujourd'hui pardon.
Despite the need for systemic changes, Legault said he wasn't considering legislation on Montreal police street checks, which, in 2019, were conducted at a rate exponentially higher than in years prior, according to a report released in October. The urban Indigenous population, like those displaced around the Cabot Square area, reported an increase in searches and ticketing after a prominent wet shelter closed shortly before the new year. 14 deaths were reported in the 11 months following the closure of the Open Door shelter.
She was in January.
A situation so dire that an international aid organization got involved to dispense health care. But in November, the situation took a positive turn with the opening of Resilience Montreal, a temporary shelter meant to replace the Open Door. On its opening day, Mayor Valérie Plante said Montreal should be, quote, a safe space.
This is one of the many ways we can contribute to the reconciliation process.
A number of other symbolic gestures were made over the year, replacing the name of genocidal General Jeffrey Amherst from a downtown street, for example, inviting a Two-Spirit elder to lead the charge at the city's Pride Parade in August.
Love can conquer hate.
and re-releasing the city's Charter of Human Rights in Mohawk to commemorate the Year of Indigenous Languages. But the school that translated the document still struggles to keep its language and culture classes going, making the year's large-scale displays of Indigenous language and culture all the more relevant.
We still speak our language, but there's not many of us.
In 2019, Indigenous artists married fantasy with reality through art displayed at Montreal Comic-Con.
This is the type of work that I do.
Innu filmmaker Kevin Bacon-Hervieux became the first Indigenous filmmaker to win an Iris Prize, the Quebec equivalent of an Oscar, for his first feature-length documentary. And before being honored by the Order of Canada this year, Alanisa Bomsawin unveiled a collection of print works in an exhibit at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts.
It's the world in me that has saved me, I think.
Little by little, advocates and allies tried to right underlying wrongs done to Indigenous peoples in Quebec, including how they're publicly represented. A Montreal tour guide went public with his request that the city modify or remove its racist statues, like this effigy of John A. Macdonald, which was vandalized several times over the year.
John A. Macdonald was responsible for genocide. This guy does not belong on Montreal's landscape.
In a Quebec first, Concordia University brought on a Mohawk journalist and publisher to create an Indigenous media studies course to combat mainstream perceptions.
I want them to understand what our realities are.
Indigenous students at nearby McGill University led a successful campaign to strip the name Redmond from its sports teams, ushering in a new era for aspiring athletes like the Ganawage Warhawks, who finally got the chance to play on a real baseball field this summer, thanks to a program run by the Toronto Blue Jays. Perhaps our most hard-hitting story came out of this roller derby match between the all-female Team Indigenous and the Jewish roller derby, in an exposition meant to bring common issues to the world stage in a way both fearsome and fierce. 2019, a year of reports and public recognition, is what leaders consider to be the catalyst for a new era of Indigenous rights recognition. On January 1st, Bill C-92 comes into effect. UNDRIP will likely be enshrined in Canadian law, and overall, the hope is that the new decade, starting in 2020, will bring both clarity and vision to Quebec and beyond. I'm Lindsay Richardson, and I'll be back to tell your stories in the new year.